April 1945. When the gates of the temporary holding camp opened, Margaret Schmidt couldn't believe her eyes. The propaganda had prepared her for monsters. Instead, she saw disciplined soldiers who looked nothing like what she'd been told to fear. These Black American troops would shatter everything she thought she knew. This is the untold story of the encounter that changed perspectives on both sides of a devastated war. The war was ending, but for Margaret Schmidt, a new and unexpected chapter was just beginning. The spring of 1945 brought more than just the thaw of German soil. It brought the arrival of the liberating Allied forces, and with them, a truth that would challenge everything she had been taught for 12 long years. Margaret had worked as a nurse in Berlin before the final collapse. She had seen the horrors of war up close, tending to wounded soldiers and civilians alike. The operating rooms had been overwhelmed with casualties, the supplies dwindling, the hope fading with each passing month. She had held the hands of dying young men who cried for their mothers in their final moments. When the city fell and chaos erupted, she fled westward with thousands of others hoping to escape the advancing Soviet forces. The journey was harrowing. Days of walking, sleeping in ditches, scavenging for food among the ruins. Like many German civilians, she ended up in a temporary holding camp run by American forces in Bavaria. The camp wasn't a prison in the traditional sense, but rather a processing center where civilians and low-ranking personnel were documented, fed, and prepared for whatever came next. It was a sprawling collection of tents and hastily constructed barracks, surrounded by wire fencing. Thousands of displaced Germans were there, all in limbo, all uncertain about their futures. The rumors spread through the camp like wildfire. Black soldiers were coming to guard them. Margaret had never seen a black person in her life. Everything she knew came from the poisonous propaganda that had saturated German society for over a decade. The films had shown degrading caricatures. The posters had depicted threatening images. The speeches had painted a picture of primitive, dangerous people who threatened civilization itself. This propaganda had been relentless, seeping into every aspect of German life, shaping perceptions without most people even realizing it. Fear gripped the camp, especially among the women. Whispered conversations turned into panicked speculation. What would these soldiers do? Would they seek revenge for the war? The women huddled together at night, some crying, some praying, all afraid. Margaret felt the fear too, a cold knot in her stomach that wouldn't go away. But part of her, the part that had seen too much already, was simply numb. When the trucks rolled in that gray April morning, Margaret stood with the other women near the wire fence watching. The vehicles kicked up dust as they approached, their engines rumbling in the quiet morning air. The camp fell silent. Everyone stopped what they were doing to watch. The tension was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. The soldiers who stepped out wore the same American uniform she had seen before, but their faces were different. These were men of the 761st Tank Battalion and the 92nd Infantry Division, units that had fought their way through some of the fiercest battles in Europe. They moved with military precision, their boots hitting the ground in unison, their equipment rattling as they formed up in organized ranks. Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington was among them. At 32, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had seen too much but remained unbroken. He was tall, with broad shoulders and cautious but kind eyes that constantly scanned his surroundings with the awareness of a combat veteran. From Mississippi, Marcus knew prejudice intimately. He had grown up in the Jim Crow South, where he had learned early what it meant to be considered less than human in his own country. He had fought 2 wars, one against the Nazis and another against the racism within his own country's military structure. The army had been segregated, with black soldiers often relegated to labor battalions or support roles. But the 761st Tank Battalion had fought in combat, had proven themselves again and again. They had liberated towns in France and Germany, had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, had earned the respect of white units who fought alongside them, even if that respect didn't extend beyond the battlefield. Despite it all, Marcus performed his duty with impeccable professionalism. He believed in the cause they were fighting for, even if that cause didn't yet fully include him. He believed that fascism had to be defeated, that the concentration camps they had discovered proved the necessity of this war, and he believed that how he conducted himself mattered, that he was representing not just himself, but every black person back home who was fighting for dignity and rights. As Marcus and his men entered the camp perimeter, he could see the fear in the civilians' eyes. He had seen it before, in France, in Belgium, in every liberated town. But this was different. These were Germans, people who had been fed a specific kind of hatred about people who looked like him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a black man from the segregated South, liberating people who had supported a regime built on racial superiority. The complexities of the situation were almost overwhelming. He took a deep breath and addressed his men quietly, reminding them to maintain discipline, to treat the civilians with respect, to remember that they were representatives of America, even if America didn't always represent them. His men nodded. They understood. They had all experienced the same contradictions, the same painful ironies. The first days were tense. The German women kept their distance, huddling together, whispering. They moved around the camp with their eyes down, avoiding eye contact with the soldiers. When the soldiers passed by, conversations would stop abruptly. The fear was a living thing, visible in every gesture, every glance. Margaret observed everything. She couldn't help herself. The nurse in her was trained to watch, to assess, to understand. She noticed how the soldiers moved with discipline, their formations precise, their duties executed efficiently. She noticed how they spoke respectfully to Lieutenant Charles Bennett, the white officer overseeing operations, but also how they spoke among themselves with easy camaraderie. She noticed how they organized the distribution of food and medical supplies with military efficiency, ensuring that everyone in the camp received their fair share. The food distribution was particularly revealing. Under the previous guards, there had been chaos and favoritism. But these new soldiers implemented a system that was scrupulously fair. They set up organized lines, checked names off lists, made sure the elderly and children went first. When some of the German men tried to push ahead, Marcus calmly but firmly established order. There was no brutality, no vindictiveness, just professional military discipline. Corporal Thomas Brown from Chicago had brought his harmonica. Music was in his blood. His grandfather had played blues in Mississippi before the family moved north during the Great Migration. Tommy had grown up with jazz and blues surrounding him, had played in small clubs before the war, had dreamed of a music career. The war had put those dreams on hold, but the harmonica was small enough to carry through combat, and it had become his companion through the long campaign across Europe. In the evenings, when duties allowed, he would sit outside the guard post and play. The music drifted across the camp, melodies that spoke of home, of longing, of hope, of sorrow. Sometimes he played blues that carried the weight of generations of struggle. Sometimes he played jazz that spoke of joy and resilience. The notes floated through the air, finding their way into tents and barracks, touching something deep in the listeners. It was the first crack in the wall of fear. Music transcends language, transcends politics, transcends the lies we tell ourselves about other people. The German civilians couldn't help but be moved by what they heard. It was too human, too full of genuine emotion to reconcile with the propaganda that had painted these soldiers as subhuman. Hannah Becker was only 22, young enough that she had spent her entire adult life under Nazi rule. She had joined the Hitler Youth at age 10, had attended the rallies, sung the songs, absorbed the ideology without question. It was all she had known. The factory work in Munich had been grueling. 12-hour shifts making munitions, her hands always stained with grease and chemicals. When the bombs finally made work impossible, she too had fled. She was terrified of these soldiers. Everything she had been taught said she should be. The propaganda films shown in the Hitler Youth had been explicit in their racist messaging. She had been told that black people were dangerous, violent, subhuman. These lies had been repeated so often, through so many channels, that they had become truth in her mind. But the music confused her. It was beautiful and sad at the same time, full of emotion that seemed deeply human. How could someone subhuman create something so moving? The contradiction gnawed at her, creating a cognitive dissonance that she couldn't ignore. She found herself drawn to the music in the evenings, standing at a distance, listening, feeling something shift inside her. One afternoon, a small crisis emerged. A child in the camp, the son of one of the German women, had fallen ill with a high fever. The boy was only 5 years old, blonde and blue-eyed, exactly what the Nazis had celebrated as the ideal. Now he lay burning with fever in a drafty tent, his mother desperate and helpless. The camp's limited medical supplies were running low, and the boy needed immediate attention. His fever was dangerously high and he was becoming delirious. Margaret, with her nursing background, was doing what she could, but it wasn't enough. She had no antibiotics, barely any fever reducers, only basic supplies that were inadequate for the situation. She sat with the mother, trying to comfort her, trying to hide her own concern. The boy needed real medicine, and soon. Marcus saw the commotion. He was making his rounds of the camp when he heard the crying. He approached carefully, aware that his presence might escalate the fear. The mother clutched her son tighter when she saw him, her eyes wide with panic. Through a translator, Marcus learned about the sick child. Without hesitation, he radioed for additional medical supplies from the main base. He explained the situation, the severity of the child's condition, the urgent need for antibiotics. The response came back quickly. Supplies would be sent within hours. Marcus stayed nearby, not intrusive but present, monitoring the situation. He had grown up poor, had seen children die from preventable illnesses because they couldn't afford doctors. He wasn't going to let that happen here, not when he could do something about it. Within hours, medicine arrived. Marcus personally carried the supplies to the tent where the boy lay. He found Margaret still there, exhausted, her hand on the child's forehead. He entered slowly, holding out the package. Margaret looked up, startled. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, across a divide of language and history and propaganda. Marcus placed the package in her hands with a simple nod. Then he explained through the translator what each medicine was for, the dosages, the timing. His instructions were clear and professional. Margaret realized he knew what he was talking about. He had received medical training in the army, had treated wounded men in the field. This wasn't just kindness, it was competence. Margaret stood there, stunned, holding the precious medicines. This wasn't supposed to happen. These men were supposed to be cruel, vengeful. Instead, this soldier had gone out of his way to help a German child. She looked into Marcus's eyes and saw something she hadn't expected. Kindness, weariness, and a deep humanity that was undeniable. She managed to whisper, "Danke," through her tears. Marcus nodded and left, not waiting for more thanks. He simply returned to his duties, leaving Margaret to administer the medicine. The boy recovered over the next few days. His fever broke, his color returned, his laughter echoed through the tent once more. Word spread through the camp faster than the rumors had spread before. The black soldiers had helped save a German child. The American sergeant had shown compassion when he had every reason to show indifference or cruelty. The narrative began to shift, slowly, person by person. Conversations changed. Some of the older Germans, those who had harbored doubts about the Nazi propaganda all along, nodded knowingly. They had suspected the lies. Others struggled more, their entire worldview crumbling. If they had been wrong about this, what else had they been wrong about? Frieda Hoffmann was 45 and had 3 sons fighting somewhere on the Eastern Front. She hadn't heard from them in months and feared the worst. The letters had stopped coming last winter. Every day she prayed they were still alive, prisoners perhaps, or wounded but recovering. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. As a mother, she understood suffering in a way that transcended politics. When she saw Marcus and his men interacting with the children in the camp, sharing chocolate rations and playing simple games during off-duty hours, something inside her broke. She watched as Tommy taught a group of kids to play a clapping game, their laughter ringing out. She watched as another soldier carved wooden toys from scrap wood, handing them out to delighted children who had lost everything. These were not monsters. These were men far from home, missing their own families, showing compassion to the children of their enemies. Frieda thought about her own sons. Were they being shown such kindness wherever they were? Or had they become the monsters she feared? One evening, Frieda approached Tommy Brown as he played his harmonica. Her heart was pounding. She had never spoken to a black person before. Such interactions had been essentially impossible in Nazi Germany. But something in his music called to her, reminded her of her own humanity. She didn't speak English and he didn't speak German, but she gestured to the instrument and smiled, tentatively. Tommy looked surprised but pleased. He understood. He played a soft melody, something gentle and hopeful. Frieda found herself humming along, finding a tune that transcended language, that spoke of universal emotions, love, loss, hope, home. Others gathered, drawn by the moment. German civilians and American soldiers standing together in the fading light sharing music. Some of the Germans began to sing softly, old folk songs from their childhoods. Some of the soldiers hummed along, finding harmonies. It was a moment of peace in the ruins of war, a glimpse of what humanity could be when the barriers came down. Lieutenant Charles Bennett observed these interactions with careful attention. He had grown up in Boston, educated at a good university, exposed to progressive ideas, but even he had absorbed the prejudices of American society. He had never questioned the segregation of the military, had accepted it as the natural order of things. Watching Marcus and his men navigate this complex situation with such grace and professionalism challenged his own assumptions. He saw how Marcus handled every situation with calm authority, how the other soldiers followed his lead, how they maintained discipline while also showing compassion. These men were excellent soldiers by any standard, yet back home they would still face discrimination, would still be denied opportunities simply because of their race. The injustice of it became impossible to ignore. Bennett made detailed notes, sensing that what was happening here was historically significant. He photographed interactions, recorded conversations, documented the transformation he was witnessing. He was a trained observer, and he recognized that this camp in Bavaria was becoming the site of something profound. Margaret began speaking with Marcus through translators. She asked him about his life, his home, his reasons for fighting. Marcus spoke carefully, sharing what he could. He told her about Mississippi, about growing up under Jim Crow laws that mandated segregation in schools, restaurants, buses, and everywhere else. He told her about signs that said, "whites only," and how it felt to be constantly reminded that you were considered less than human. He told her about the fear that came with stepping out of line, the danger that any black person faced in the South for the smallest perceived transgression. He told her about joining the army despite knowing he would face discrimination from his own countrymen. He told her about being assigned to a segregated unit, about fighting to even be allowed into combat because the military brass didn't believe black soldiers could fight effectively. He told her about proving them wrong, about the 761st's record of success, about the respect they had earned. And he told her about fighting for a country that didn't fully recognize his humanity, and yet fighting still because the cause against fascism was just. He told her about the concentration camps, about Buchenwald, about the horror of seeing what hatred taken to its extreme could do. Margaret was shaken to her core. This man had suffered prejudice perhaps not so different in spirit from what she was now experiencing in reverse. She had supported a regime that preached racial superiority, and now she was learning humanity from someone that regime had deemed inferior. The irony was crushing. The cognitive dissonance was painful, but necessary. It forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself, about what she had believed, about what she had been complicit in. She had known about the persecution of Jews, had seen her neighbors disappear, had heard the whispers. She had chosen not to look too closely, chosen to believe what was convenient. Now, sitting across from Marcus hearing his story, she couldn't hide from the truth anymore. The propaganda had been lies. The ideology had been evil, and she had been part of it, even if only through her silence and acceptance. Hannah began volunteering to help with camp organization, working alongside the soldiers. At first, she kept her distance from the black troops, still nervous, still uncertain. But as days passed, she found herself in conversations. Tommy taught her a few English words. She taught him some German phrases. They laughed at mispronunciations. The simple act of shared laughter was revolutionary. Laughter is intimate. It requires a connection, a shared moment of joy. You can't truly laugh with someone while still believing they're subhuman. The propaganda crumbled a little more with each giggle, each shared smile. As spring deepened, the camp became something unexpected, a place of transformation. The German civilians were still displaced, still uncertain about their futures, but the fear of their guards had been replaced by something more complex. Respect, understanding, even friendship in some cases. Children who had been terrified at first now ran up to the soldiers, begging for candy or attention. The soldiers, many of them fathers or uncles back home, obliged when they could. They taught the kids to throw American footballs. They shared stories even when neither side could understand the words, the gestures and expressions conveying enough. Marcus never forgot where he was or what had happened. Germany had brought unspeakable evil into the world. The concentration camps were being discovered, revealing horrors beyond imagination. He had seen Buchenwald himself, had witnessed what hatred taken to its extreme could do. He had seen the emaciated survivors, the piles of bodies, the evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. He had smelled the smell that you could never forget, the sweet, sick smell of death multiplied by thousands. He had looked into the eyes of the survivors and seen something broken, something that could never fully heal. He had understood then, in a way that no words could capture, what the ideology of racial hatred led to when given absolute power. So his kindness to these civilians was not naive. It wasn't forgetting or forgiving what Germany had done. It was a conscious choice to break the cycle, to show that humanity could persist even in the aftermath of inhumanity. It was refusing to become what he had fought against, refusing to dehumanize others even when they or their country had dehumanized millions. One day, a group of former Wehrmacht soldiers was brought to the camp for processing. They were exhausted, defeated men, their uniforms torn and dirty, their faces hollow with hunger and despair. Among them was a young soldier, barely 18, who collapsed from malnutrition shortly after arrival. Marcus organized immediate medical care. He had the young man brought to the camp infirmary and ensured he received food and water in careful amounts. You couldn't just feed a starving person. Their system couldn't handle it. Marcus knew this from his training, and he made sure the medics followed the proper procedures. Later, when the young man was recovering, lying on a cot with some color returning to his cheeks, he asked through a translator why the American soldier had helped him. The boy looked confused, as if the world had stopped making sense. He had been taught that the Americans were the enemy, that the black soldiers in particular would be brutal. Yet here he was, being saved by the very people he had been taught to fear and hate. Marcus looked at him for a long moment before responding. He said that he had fought against what Germany had become, against the ideology that had caused so much suffering. But he would not become like that ideology. He would not dehumanize others, even his enemies, because that was the very thing he had been fighting against. If he treated this young soldier as less than human, if he denied him care, if he sought revenge, then what had he been fighting for? The cycle of hatred had to stop somewhere, and he chose to stop it here, in his actions, in his choices. The young German soldier began to cry. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps relief, perhaps shame for what his country had done. Perhaps it was the breaking of all his certainties, the collapse of the worldview he had been fed since childhood. Tears streamed down his face as his body shook with sobs. Marcus simply nodded and walked away, leaving the young man to process his emotions, to begin the long, difficult work of understanding and reckoning with the truth. Some journeys had to be taken alone. Margaret witnessed this exchange from a distance. She had been helping in the infirmary, and she saw everything. That evening she wrote in a small journal she had managed to keep throughout her ordeal. The journal was tattered, its pages filled with the cramped handwriting of someone recording history as it happened, trying to make sense of the senseless. She wrote about the propaganda she had believed, about her fear when the black soldiers arrived, about her shame for believing the lies. She wrote about Marcus and Tommy and the other soldiers who had shown her that human dignity was not determined by race or nationality, but by choices and actions. She wrote, "I thought I knew what the world was. I thought I understood who was superior and who was inferior. I was wrong about everything. The men I was taught to fear have shown me more humanity than my own government ever did. They have shown me what real strength looks like. The strength to show compassion to your enemies, to maintain dignity in the face of hatred, to choose kindness when cruelty would be easier. I don't know how to live with what I have learned, but I know I can never unlearn it. The scales have fallen from my eyes, and I see clearly for the first time in years." Frida found Margaret writing and sat beside her. The two women had become friends in the camp, bonded by shared experiences and the transformation they were both undergoing. They talked deep into the night, their voices low in the darkness, sharing thoughts they had never been able to speak aloud before. Frida spoke about her sons, about her hopes that they had survived, and her new fear of what they might have done or witnessed. Had they participated in atrocities? Had they been in the camps? Had they killed innocents? These questions haunted her now in a way they hadn't before. She had simply wanted them to survive. Now she wanted them to have survived without losing their souls. She spoke about her gratitude that these American soldiers had treated her with decency when they had every reason not to. She spoke about how watching them had changed her understanding of humanity. She said she wished she had had this knowledge years ago, wished she had stood up against the propaganda, against the evil that had taken over her country. Margaret understood. They were both grappling with guilt, with complicity, with the knowledge that they had been part of something monstrous, even if only through their silence and acceptance. There was no easy absolution, no way to undo the past. All they could do was commit to being different in the future, to speaking truth, to never again allowing hatred to go unchallenged. The camp was temporary. Eventually, it would close, and the civilians would be released to begin rebuilding their shattered country. Marcus and his battalion would move on to occupation duties elsewhere, but the impact of those weeks would last far longer. On one of the last days before the camp's closure, a small ceremony was organized. Lieutenant Bennett, recognizing the historical significance of what had transpired, arranged for photographs to be taken. He wanted to document this moment, this unusual peace between former enemies, this evidence that transformation was possible. The German civilians gathered on one side, the soldiers on the other. The photographer prepared his equipment, checking the light, adjusting his settings. Then, spontaneously, without prompting, the groups began to mix. Margaret walked over and stood beside Marcus. Hannah stood beside Tommy. Frida stood with several soldiers, smiling despite everything. These photographs would be filed away in military archives, rarely seen for decades, but they captured something profound. They showed former enemies standing together not in hostility, but in mutual recognition of shared humanity. The images were grainy, black and white, but the emotions they captured were vivid and real. In one photo, Marcus has his hand on the shoulder of a young German boy, both looking at the camera with serious expressions. In another, Tommy and Hannah are laughing at something, the joy on their faces transcending the barriers between them. In another, Frida is crying while a soldier offers her a handkerchief, a small gesture of kindness captured forever. Margaret approached Marcus before his departure. Through a translator, she thanked him. She told him that he and his men had given her something she didn't deserve: compassion. She said she would spend the rest of her life trying to deserve it, trying to build a better Germany that would never again fall into the darkness of hatred. She told him she would teach others what she had learned, that she would speak the truth about what had happened, about the propaganda and the lies and the evil that had been done. She told him she would never be silent again, that she owed that much to the victims, to the future, to the soldiers who had shown her mercy. Marcus shook her hand, a simple gesture that carried immense weight. His grip was firm but gentle. He looked her in the eye and told her that the work of building a just world was never finished, that it required constant effort from everyone. He told her that hatred was always waiting to rise again, that it took courage to stand against it, especially when it came from your own people. He told her to teach others what she had learned, to be a witness to the truth, to never let the lies take hold again. He told her that Germany would need people like her, people who had seen clearly, people who were committed to building something better. It wouldn't be easy, he said, but nothing worthwhile ever was. As the trucks pulled away, many of the German women waved. Children ran alongside the vehicles for a short distance before stopping, still waving. Some women cried, and these were not tears of relief at seeing guards leave. They were tears of gratitude, of sadness at parting, of transformation and recognition. The civilians were losing something they hadn't expected to value: the presence of men who had challenged their prejudices, who had shown them a better way, who had treated them with dignity when they had expected the opposite. Tommy played his harmonica one last time as the convoy rolled out, the melody carrying across the Bavarian countryside. It was a blues number, slow and mournful, speaking of partings and journeys and the bittersweet nature of human connection. The notes floated on the spring air, growing fainter as the trucks drove away. Hannah stood at the camp fence listening until she couldn't hear it anymore. She strained her ears, trying to catch the last faint notes, not wanting to let go of this moment. When the music finally faded completely into the distance, she stood there for a long time, her hands gripping the wire, tears on her face. Then she turned back to face an uncertain future. but one in which she now knew that the propaganda had been lies, that humanity existed across all boundaries of race and nation, that people could choose compassion over hatred. She carried that knowledge with her as she left the camp days later, walking toward whatever came next with a fundamentally changed understanding of the world. The story of these encounters was not widely told in the years that followed. The black soldiers who served in World War II often found their contributions minimized or erased in the official histories. The narrative of the war focused on other stories, other heroes, while the men of the 761st Tank Battalion and the 92nd Infantry Division faded into the background of history. They returned home to a segregated America, where they were still denied basic rights despite their service and sacrifice. Marcus went back to Mississippi, where he would continue fighting for civil rights, carrying with him the knowledge that he had served with honor, even when his country didn't honor him fully in return. He became active in the local NAACP, organized voter registration drives, faced down threats and violence, always maintaining the same dignity he had shown in Germany. Tommy returned to Chicago, where he played music in clubs and taught neighborhood kids to play instruments. He rarely talked about the war, but when he did, he always mentioned the camp in Bavaria, the German civilians who had transformed before his eyes, the proof that people could change if given the chance to see truth. Margaret rebuilt her life in the new Germany that emerged from the ruins. She became a teacher in a small school in Bavaria, not far from where the camp had been. She married a man who had spent the war in a POW camp in England, someone who understood shame and the need for redemption. They had 2 children, and Margaret raised them with stories of the spring of 1945. She always told her students about the American soldiers who taught her the most important lesson of her life. She showed them her journal, the tattered pages a testament to transformation. She brought in the photograph that Bennett had given her, showing her standing beside Marcus, 2 people from different worlds finding common humanity. She kept that journal until her death in 1987, and her children donated it to a museum where it became part of the historical record. Scholars would later study her words, finding in them a rare first-hand account of the psychological impact of encountering reality after years of propaganda. The encounter between German civilians and Black American soldiers in 1945 represented a unique moment in history. For the Germans, especially those who had never questioned the Nazi racial ideology, it was a jarring confrontation with reality. The soldiers they met were educated, disciplined, compassionate, and every bit as human as anyone else. The cognitive dissonance this created forced a reckoning that propaganda alone could never have achieved. For the black soldiers, it was a complex and bittersweet experience. They were liberators in a foreign land, given a respect and authority that they were often denied at home. Yet they knew that their fight for equality would continue long after the war ended. The irony of fighting against Nazi racism while experiencing American racism was not lost on them. But they performed their duties with professionalism and dignity, knowing that they were representing not just themselves, but their entire community. The children in the camp would remember these soldiers for the rest of their lives. The chocolate they shared, the games they played, the kindness they showed, all became core memories that shaped how these children understood race and humanity. Some of these children, decades later, would speak out against racism in Germany, citing their childhood experiences with the American soldiers as formative moments. One of those children, a man named Klaus, who had been 7 years old in the camp, would write in his memoir, "The first black man I ever saw gave me chocolate and carved me a toy soldier. He was gentle and kind. Every time I hear racist rhetoric, I remember that man, and I know it's lies. I wish everyone could have had that experience, could have seen what I saw." Lieutenant Bennett returned to Boston and became a historian. He wrote about his experiences, though his work was not widely published during his lifetime. His detailed notes and photographs, however, eventually made their way into archives and became valuable resources for scholars studying this period. The 761st Tank Battalion and the 92nd Infantry Division returned to America as decorated units. They had fought bravely, suffered casualties, and performed their missions effectively. Yet the recognition they deserved was slow in coming. It would take decades before the full contribution of black soldiers in World War II was properly acknowledged. The temporary camp in Bavaria was dismantled in the summer of 1945. The tents came down, the barracks were disassembled, the wire fencing rolled up, the land returned to farming. Within a year, you couldn't tell there had been a camp there at all. No monument marks the spot where these transformative encounters took place, but the impact rippled outward in ways both seen and unseen. Every person whose prejudice was challenged, every mind that was changed, became a small victory against the forces of hatred. Margaret taught hundreds of students over her career, and she made sure every one of them learned about the spring of 1945. Those students grew up with a different understanding, and some of them passed it on to their own children. History is made not just in grand battles and political decisions, but in countless individual moments of choice. Marcus chose compassion over bitterness. Margaret chose growth over rigid belief. Tommy chose music and friendship. Hannah chose curiosity over fear. Frida chose maternal wisdom over propaganda. Each choice mattered. The lesson of that spring in 1945 remains relevant. Prejudice thrives in ignorance and is maintained by dehumanization. When people meet as individuals, when they share food and music and stories, when they help each other in times of need, the walls of hatred become harder to maintain. This doesn't mean all conflicts disappear or that injustice is easily overcome, but it means that human connection is a powerful force, one that can challenge even the most entrenched ideologies. The German women who left that camp carried with them a truth that no propaganda could erase. They had seen with their own eyes that the lies they had been told were lies. They had experienced kindness from those they were taught to fear. And in the rebuilding of Germany, in the slow, painful process of confronting the Nazi past, these personal experiences mattered. They made it harder to deny, harder to forget, harder to repeat. For the black soldiers, the experience was bittersweet. They had proven themselves again and again in combat and in occupation duties. They had shown professionalism, courage, and humanity. Yet they knew that back home, they would still face discrimination, still fight for basic rights, still struggle for equality. But they also knew their worth, knew their dignity, and that knowledge would fuel the civil rights movement that was to come. Years later, when Margaret was an old woman in her 70s, a young student asked her what had been the most important moment of her life. She thought for a long time before answering. She spoke about that April morning when the trucks arrived, and her entire worldview began to crumble. She spoke about unlearning hatred and relearning humanity. She spoke about Marcus and the lesson of quiet dignity in the face of injustice. And she told the student that the most important thing anyone could do was to question their prejudices, to meet people as individuals, and to never let ideology blind them to human truth. She said that it was easy to hate categories of people, but much harder to hate individuals once you knew their stories. She said that was why propaganda always dehumanized, always used abstractions and stereotypes, because knowing people as people made hatred nearly impossible. The story of German women encountering Black American soldiers in 1945 is not just about World War II. It's about the human capacity for change, about the power of personal experience to overcome indoctrination, about the choice to extend or withhold compassion. It's about men who fought for freedom while being denied full freedom themselves, and about people who learned to see clearly after years of deliberately imposed blindness. In the end, perhaps the most radical thing Marcus and his fellow soldiers did was simply to be themselves, professional, competent, kind, and fully human. In doing so, they dismantled lies without saying a word. Their existence, their actions, their dignity spoke louder than any propaganda could shout. And for those who were willing to see, the message was clear and life-changing. The legacy of these encounters lives on in the memories passed down through families, in the archived photographs and letters, in the scholarly work that has slowly brought these stories to light. It lives on in every person who learns this history and recognizes its relevance to our current struggles against prejudice and dehumanization. We've never seen men like this, Margarete had thought that first day. And she was right. Not because these men were so different from other men, but because she had never been allowed to see them truly. When the blinders came off, when the propaganda fell away, what she saw was both surprising and utterly ordinary. Human beings, complex and flawed and capable of great kindness. That recognition, that simple acknowledgement of shared humanity, was revolutionary then and remains revolutionary now. If you found this untold story powerful and thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more hidden histories that shaped our world in profound ways. Hit the like button if this story challenged your perspective and made you think differently about humanity and prejudice. Leave a comment sharing what historical moment you'd like us to uncover next, or tell us about your own family's stories from this era. These stories matter deeply, and your engagement helps ensure they're not forgotten by future generations.